Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal reality of a Viking winter. Picture this. It's December in medieval Norway, and the sun hasn't shown its face for weeks. Outside, the wind howls like a hungry wolf, and snow piles against wooden walls thick as a man's torso. Inside a long house, 30 people huddle together in the flickering darkness, their breath visible in the frigid air. The question that haunts historians and fascinates us today is simple. How did these people survive the night without freezing to death? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The answer to Viking winter survival isn't what most people think. It wasn't just about thick furs or roaring farm or engine fires. It was about some thinges, something that modern science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just how Vikings conquered the cold, but why their methods were so effective that some are still used in extreme environments today. But first, let me paint you a picture of what we Longhouse were dealing with. A Viking's your cozy modern cabin. These structures were massive communal halls, sometimes stretching over 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. Imagine a wooden airplane hangar, but filled with people, animals, and the constant struggle against temperatures that could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Archaeological evidence from sites across Scandinavia reveals that these longhouses were marvels of engineering, but they were also death traps waiting to happen. The walls were made of wood and turf, the roofs thatched with straw. There were no glass windows, no insulation as we know it, and definitely no central heating. Just a long fire pit running down the center of the hall, smoke curling up toward a hole in the roof, and dozens of people trying to stay alive until spring. Here's where it gets interesting. Recent excavations at sites like Borg in Norway have uncovered something remarkable. The sleeping arrangements in these longhouses weren't random. They were carefully orchestrated systems designed to maximize heat retention and minimize the risk of hypothermia. Every person had a specific place, and that place was determined by a complex social hierarchy that literally meant the difference between life and death. The most important discovery came from analyzing the layout of sleeping benches found in these archaeological sites. These weren't just random wooden platforms. They were positioned at specific distances from the central fire at precise angles that maximized radiant heat while minimizing exposure to deadly drafts. The Vikings had figured out something that modern thermal engineers spend years studying: how to create microclimates within a larger space. But here's the part that will blow your mind. The Vikings didn't just rely on external heat sources. They had mastered the art of human heat generation and retention in ways that would make modern survival experts jealous. They understood that the human body is essentially a biological furnace, producing heat through metabolism, muscle activity, and even the process of digestion. The key was learning how to capture and redistribute that heat efficiently. Archaeological analysis of textile remains shows that Viking winter clothing wasn't just about thickness. It was about layering systems that created multiple thermal barriers. They wore linen undergarments that wickered moisture away from the skin, wool middle layers that trapped warm air, and outer garments made from specially treated animal hides that blocked wind and snow. But here's the crucial part. They didn't sleep in these clothes. Inside the Longhouse, Vikings used a completely different strategy. They stripped down to lightweight garments and relied on shared body heat under massive communal blankets made from layered furs and woven wool. Think of it as a medieval sleeping bag designed for 30 people. The science behind this is fascinating. When multiple bodies share a confined space, they create what thermal experts call a heat bubble. Body heat gets trapped and redistributed, creating a microenvironment that can be 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the surrounding air. But the real genius wasn't just in the sleeping arrangements. It was in how the Vikings managed the entire thermal ecosystem of the Longhouse. Recent studies using thermal imaging on reconstructed Viking buildings have revealed something extraordinary. These structures were designed as giant heat engines, with every element working together to capture, store, and redistribute warmth. The central fire pit wasn't just for cooking and light, it was the heart of a sophisticated heating system. The stones surrounding the fire absorbed heat during the day and continued radiating warmth long after the flames died down. The smoke from the fire didn't just escape through the roof. It traveled along the walls, warming the sleeping areas before finally exiting the building. Even the animals kept in the Longhouse served a purpose beyond food and companionship. Their body heat contributed to the overall thermal environment. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements shows that Vikings even used the heat generated by decomposing organic matter. They would bury food scraps and waste in specific locations around the Longhouse, creating what we now call compost heating. As these materials decomposed, they generated heat that helped warm the floors and walls. It's a principle that modern sustainable architecture is rediscovering today. The social dynamics of staying warm were just as important as the physical techniques. Vikings developed strict protocols for sharing warmth that governed everything from sleeping positions to breathing patterns. Children and elderly people were placed in the warmest spots, surrounded by adults who acted as human heat shields. Young warriors who generated the most body heat were positioned strategically around the perimeter to create thermal barriers. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Viking winter survival was their understanding of thermal timing. They knew that the human body's core temperature naturally drops during sleep, making people vulnerable to hypothermia in the early morning hours. To combat this, they developed a system of rotating sleep schedules that ensured someone was always awake to tend the fire and monitor the thermal environment. Recent research has revealed that Vikings also used controlled breathing techniques to generate internal heat. By practicing specific breathing patterns before sleep, they could raise their core body temperature and maintain it throughout the night. This isn't just speculation. Analysis of runic inscriptions and saga descriptions reveals clear references to these thermal breathing practices. The Vikings also understood something that modern science has only recently confirmed. Diet plays a crucial role in cold weather survival. They consumed specific combinations of foods before bedtime that maximized internal heat production. High-fat foods provided slow-burning fuel for the body's metabolic furnace, while certain spices and herbs increased circulation and heat generation. Archaeological analysis of cooking remains shows that Vikings prepared special winter meals designed to optimize body heat. They combined seal fat, nuts, and fermented fish in precise ratios that provided sustained energy and internal warmth. They even timed their meals to coincide with natural circadian rhythms, eating their largest meal just before sleep to fuel their bodies through the coldest part of the night. The mental aspects of staying warm were equally important. Vikings developed psychological techniques for managing cold stress that modern military survival training has adopted. They used visualization, storytelling, and group singing to maintain morale and generate internal heat through mental focus and physical activity. But all of these techniques would have been useless without the most important element, community cooperation. Surviving a Viking winter wasn't an individual challenge. It was a collective effort that required every person in the Longhouse to contribute to the thermal welfare of the group. Selfishness meant death, not just for the individual, but potentially for everyone. The engineering principles behind Viking winter survival are so effective that they're still being studied today. NASA researchers have analyzed Viking thermal management techniques for potential use in space habitats. Arctic explorers use modified versions of Viking sleeping systems. Even modern homeless shelters have adopted elements of Viking communal warming strategies. What makes this story even more remarkable is that these weren't just survival techniques. They were sophisticated technologies developed over centuries of trial and error, passed down through generations, and refined to near perfection. The Vikings didn't just endure winter, they conquered it using nothing but wood, wool, fire, and human ingenuity. The archaeological record reveals something even more extraordinary about Viking thermal engineering. At excavation sites throughout Iceland and Greenland, researchers have uncovered evidence of what can only be described as medieval heat recovery systems. These weren't accidental discoveries. They were deliberate innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available technology. Consider the Longhouse discovered at Longhouses Meadows in Newfoundland. Carbon dating and thermal analysis revealed that the Vikings had constructed underground channels that circulated warm air from the central fire throughout the building. These channels, carved into the earth beneath the floor, created a primitive but effective underfloor heating system. The warm air would travel through these tunnels, heating the ground where people slept, before eventually escaping through carefully positioned vents. But the genius didn't stop there. The Vikings understood thermal mass in ways that would impress modern architects. They strategically placed large stones around the longhouse that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly throughout the night. These stones weren't randomly chosen. Archaeological analysis shows they specifically selected rocks with high thermal capacity, stones that could store and release heat efficiently over extended periods. The placement of these thermal stones followed precise patterns. They were positioned to create thermal gradients that directed warm air toward sleeping areas while preventing cold drafts from penetrating the living space. Some stones were even carved with channels that guided airflow in specific directions, creating what amounted to a Stone Age climate control system. Recent discoveries in Denmark have revealed another remarkable innovation: thermal chimneys. These weren't the simple smoke holes that most people imagine. They were sophisticated structures designed to create thermal draft effects that pulled warm air up from the living areas while simultaneously drawing fresh air in from carefully positioned intake vents. The system created a continuous circulation of warm air throughout the Longhouse. The Vikings also mastered the art of thermal zoning. Different areas of the Longhouse served different thermal purposes. The area immediately around the central fire was used for cooking and daytime activities. The middle zones were designed for general living and working. The outer areas, which received the least direct heat from the fire, were used for food storage and as thermal buffer zones that protected the warmer inner areas from exterior cold. Archaeological textile analysis has revealed that Vikings created specialized bedding systems that went far beyond simple furs and blankets. They wove wool in specific patterns that created air pockets for insulation while allowing moisture to escape. They layered different materials in precise sequences that maximized thermal efficiency. Some textiles were even treated with animal oils that enhanced their water-resistant properties while maintaining breathability. The sleeping arrangements themselves were marvels of thermal engineering. Vikings didn't just pile together randomly. They arranged themselves in specific patterns that optimized heat sharing while ensuring everyone received adequate warmth. Larger individuals were positioned to act as thermal anchors, providing steady heat for smaller family members. Pregnant women and infants were placed in the warmest positions, surrounded by multiple heat sources. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Viking thermal management was their understanding of humidity control. Excess moisture in the air could be deadly in cold conditions, leading to hypothermia and respiratory problems. Vikings developed ingenious methods for managing indoor humidity levels, using materials that could absorb excess moisture while releasing it when conditions were appropriate. They hung specially prepared animal hides in strategic locations that acted as natural humidity regulators. These hides would absorb moisture from breath and perspiration during the night, then release it during the warmer parts of the day when the longhouse was heated by the central fire. This system prevented the dangerous buildup of moisture that could freeze on walls and bedding. The Vikings also used plants and natural materials as thermal regulators. Archaeological evidence shows they gathered specific types of moss, lichen, and dried grasses that had insulating properties. These materials were used not just as bedding, but as thermal barriers placed in walls and under sleeping areas. Some of these natural insulators were so effective that modern outdoor gear manufacturers have studied their properties for potential applications. Temperature monitoring wasn't left to chance either. Vikings developed remarkably accurate methods for measuring and predicting thermal conditions inside their longhouses. They used natural indicators like the behavior of animals, the formation of frost patterns, and even the way smoke moved through the building to gauge temperature and adjust their heating strategies accordingly. The social protocols surrounding thermal management were as complex as the technical systems. Vikings had established hierarchies that determined who slept where, when fires could be tended, and how resources like fuel and food were allocated to maintain optimal temperature. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were survival protocols developed through generations of experience with life and death thermal management. Children were taught from an early age how to contribute to the thermal welfare of the community. They learned to recognize signs of hypothermia in others, how to properly tend fires without wasting fuel, and how to arrange bedding materials for maximum efficiency. These skills weren't optional education. They were essential survival knowledge that every person needed to master. The Vikings even developed backup thermal systems for extreme conditions. When primary heating methods failed due to fuel shortages or severe weather, they had secondary and tertiary warming strategies. These included techniques for generating heat through physical exercise, methods for concentrating body heat in smaller spaces, and emergency protocols for sharing the warmest clothing and bedding among the most vulnerable community members. Modern research has revealed that Vikings understood the relationship between nutrition and cold resistance in ways that anticipated current scientific knowledge by centuries. They knew that certain foods could literally warm the body from the inside, and they planned their winter diets accordingly. They consumed specific combinations of fats, proteins, and fermented foods that optimized their body's ability to generate and maintain heat. The fermentation process itself served a dual purpose. Not only did fermented foods provide essential nutrients during the long winter months when fresh food was scarce, but the fermentation process actually generated heat. Large containers of fermenting foods were strategically placed around the longhouse to contribute additional thermal energy to the overall heating system. Archaeological analysis of Viking winter food storage reveals another layer of thermal sophistication. They didn't just store food to prevent spoilage. They arranged their food storage systems to contribute to the thermal management of the longhouse. Grain stores, preserved meats, and other food supplies were positioned to act as thermal mass, absorbing heat during warmer periods and releasing it when temperatures dropped. The Vikings even understood how to use the thermal properties of different materials for cooking and heating efficiency. They knew which types of wood burned hottest and longest, which materials produced the least smoke, and how to arrange fuel to maximize heat output while minimizing consumption. This wasn't just practical knowledge. It was sophisticated energy management that could mean the difference between surviving winter and perishing from cold and starvation. Perhaps most remarkably, Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that Vikings may have developed primitive forms of solar heating. Structures have been found with carefully angled openings and reflective surfaces that captured and concentrated sunlight during the brief winter days. These solar collectors, combined with thermal mass storage systems, allowed them to harvest and store solar energy even during the darkest months of the year. The sophistication of these thermal management systems becomes even more impressive when you consider the tools and materials Vikings had available. They achieved remarkable feats of thermal engineering using only stone, wood, animal products, and human labor. No fossil fuels, no electricity, no modern insulation materials. Just centuries of accumulated knowledge and relentless innovation, driven by the absolute necessity of staying warm enough to survive. The thermal innovations didn't end with static systems. Vikings developed what can only be described as dynamic heating strategies that adapted to changing conditions throughout the winter months. As temperatures fluctuated and fuel supplies dwindled, they had contingency plans that could be implemented at a moment's notice. One of the most ingenious discoveries comes from excavations in northern Sweden, where archaeologists uncovered evidence of movable thermal barriers. These were large wooden screens covered with specially treated hides that could be repositioned throughout the longhouse to redirect heat flow and create warmer microzones when needed. During the coldest nights, these barriers could transform a large communal space into smaller, more easily heated chambers. The Vikings also mastered the art of thermal layering at the architectural level. Recent analysis using ground-penetrating radar has revealed that many longhouses were built with multiple floor levels, each designed to capture and utilize heat in different ways. The lower levels, partially underground, benefited from geothermal stability. The main floor captured heat from the central fire. Upper sleeping lofts, built into the roof structure, utilized the natural tendency of warm air to rise. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking thermal engineering was their understanding of human physiology in cold conditions. They knew that certain parts of the body were more critical for maintaining core temperature than others. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed specialized warming techniques for hands, feet, and necks, the areas where heat loss could be most dangerous. They created what we might recognize today as primitive heating pads, using stones heated by the fire and wrapped in wool or fur. These heated stones were placed at specific points on the body to maximize circulation and prevent frostbite. The stones were carefully sized and shaped to provide optimal heat transfer without causing burns. Some were even carved with grooves that allowed them to conform to body contours for maximum contact and heat transfer. The Vikings understood that staying warm wasn't just about adding heat. It was equally important to prevent heat loss. They developed sophisticated techniques for sealing gaps in walls and around openings that could let in deadly drafts. Using a combination of clay, animal hair, and plant fibers, they created weatherproofing compounds that could expand and contract with temperature changes without cracking. Recent microscopic analysis of these sealing compounds has revealed their remarkable sophistication. The Vikings had discovered how to create materials with properties similar to modern weather stripping, using only natural ingredients. These compounds could maintain their flexibility in extreme cold while providing effective thermal barriers. The management of air quality was another critical survival that aspect of winter Vikings had mastered. In a sealed environment filled with people and animals, carbon dioxide buildup and oxygen depletion could be as deadly as cold. Vikings developed ventilation systems that provided fresh air without sacrificing precious heat. They created what amounted to heat exchangers, using hollow bones or carved wooden tubes to bring fresh air into the longhouse while simultaneously warming it with outgoing air. These primitive heat recovery ventilation systems ensured that people could breathe safely without freezing. The engineering principles behind these systems are still used in modern energy-efficient buildings. The Vikings also understood the psychological aspects of surviving extreme cold. They developed storytelling traditions, games, and communal activities specifically designed to keep people mentally engaged and physically active during the long winter months. These weren't just entertainment. They were survival strategies that prevented the depression and lethargy that could be fatal in cold conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings organized their winter activities around thermal optimization. Crafts like weaving, wood carving, and metalworking were scheduled for specific times and locations within the longhouse to maximize both productivity and heat generation. Even the positioning of looms and workbenches was calculated to create thermal benefits. The metalworking activities, in particular, served dual purposes. While Vikings crafted tools, weapons, and jewelry during the winter months, the forges and anvils generated significant heat that contributed to the overall thermal environment. The timing of these activities was carefully planned to provide additional warmth during the coldest parts of the day and night. Food preparation was another source of thermal energy that Vikings exploited systematically. Cooking wasn't just about nutrition, it was a heating strategy that provided warmth through the preparation process, the consumption of hot food, and the metabolic heat generated by digestion. They planned their meal schedules to coincide with natural dips in body temperature, using hot food as a thermal boost when it was most needed. The Vikings even developed specialized cooking techniques that maximized heat production. They knew how to prepare foods that would generate internal heat through spice combinations and preparation methods that increased circulation and metabolic activity. Some of these thermal cooking techniques are still used in traditional Scandinavian cuisine today. Recent research has uncovered evidence that Vikings may have used controlled hypothermia as a survival strategy. During periods of extreme cold or food scarcity, they could deliberately lower their metabolic rate and body temperature to conserve energy and resources. This wasn't accidental. It was a sophisticated physiological adaptation that allowed them to survive conditions that would kill most people. The techniques for inducing and recovering from controlled hypothermia required precise knowledge of human physiology and careful monitoring of vital signs. Vikings developed ways to recognize the safe limits of this practice and protocols for safely warming people back to normal body temperature. Modern medical research has only recently begun to understand how controlled hypothermia can be used therapeutically. The training required to master these thermal survival techniques began in childhood. Young Vikings were gradually exposed to cold conditions in controlled ways that built their tolerance and taught them the skills they would need to survive as adults. This wasn't cruel treatment. It was essential education that could mean the difference between life and death. Children learned to recognize the early signs of hypothermia and frostbite in themselves and others. They practiced the breathing techniques and physical exercises that could generate internal heat. They memorized the thermal properties of different materials and learned how to construct emergency shelters using minimal resources. By adulthood, every Viking possessed sophisticated knowledge of thermal management that would impress modern survival experts. The seasonal preparation for winter began months in advance. Vikings didn't just gather food and fuel, they prepared their thermal systems, tested their heating strategies, and made repairs to their longhouses based on lessons learned from previous winters. This preparation involved the entire community and required coordination between multiple families and social groups. The sophistication of Viking thermal management becomes even more impressive when you consider the scale of their settlements. Some longhouses accommodated extended families of 50 or more people. Managing the thermal needs of such large groups required organizational skills and technical knowledge that rivaled modern facility management. They developed protocols for thermal resource allocation that balanced individual needs against community welfare. Fuel was distributed based on carefully calculated formulas that considered family size, age demographics, and thermal contributions. These weren't arbitrary decisions. They were mathematically precise calculations that optimized survival chances for the entire community. The Vikings even developed techniques for thermal forecasting, predicting how much fuel and food would be needed based on weather patterns, community size, and historical data. They kept detailed mental records of previous winters that allowed them to plan resources and strategies with remarkable accuracy. Archaeological analysis of refuse pits and storage areas has revealed the precision of these calculations. Vikings could predict their thermal resource needs with accuracy that often came within 5% of actual consumption. This level of planning required sophisticated understanding of both thermal dynamics and resource management. The legacy of Viking thermal engineering extends far beyond historical curiosity. Many of their techniques have been rediscovered and adapted for modern applications. Military cold weather training incorporates Viking breathing techniques and group warming strategies. Sustainable architecture borrows from Viking thermal mass and heat recovery systems. Even space exploration has adopted Viking principles for managing thermal environments in extreme conditions. The most remarkable aspect of this entire system wasn't any single innovation, but the integration of multiple technologies into a comprehensive survival strategy. Vikings didn't just solve the problem of staying warm. They created a complete technological ecosystem that addressed every aspect of winter survival, from individual physiology to community organization. This integration required not just technical knowledge, but social cooperation on a scale that modern societies struggle to achieve. Every person had to understand their role in the thermal management system and execute it perfectly. A single mistake could compromise the survival of the entire community. The Vikings proved that with sufficient knowledge, cooperation, and ingenuity, humans could not only survive, but thrive in conditions that seem impossible. They didn't just endure winter, they conquered it so completely that they were able to expand their civilization into some of the most challenging environments on Earth, from the Arctic Circle to the coast of North America. Their thermal technologies represent one of humanity's greatest achievements in environmental adaptation, accomplished without any of the energy sources or materials we consider essential today. They did it with wood, stone, wool, and an understanding of thermal dynamics that wouldn't be matched by formal science for another 1,000 years. The psychological warfare against winter was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Viking survival strategy. Modern psychology has only recently begun to understand what Vikings instinctively knew: that mental state directly affects physical tolerance to extreme conditions. They developed what can only be described as cognitive thermal techniques that allowed them to override their body's natural responses to cold. These weren't simple mind over matter approaches. Vikings understood that certain mental states could actually increase blood flow to extremities, boost metabolic heat production, and enhance the body's ability to conserve core temperature. They practiced visualization exercises where they mentally rehearsed staying warm, imagining heat flowing through their bodies in specific patterns that matched actual physiological processes. Archaeological evidence from runic inscriptions and saga fragments reveals that Vikings used rhythmic chanting and group breathing exercises that served multiple thermal purposes. The synchronized breathing created shared carbon dioxide that slightly warmed the air in sleeping areas. The rhythmic nature of these exercises increased heart rate and circulation without requiring excessive physical movement that could disrupt sleeping arrangements. The acoustic properties of the Longhouse were deliberately designed to support these thermal breathing techniques. The curved walls and roof structure created resonance chambers that amplified certain frequencies, allowing whispered chants and breathing exercises to be heard throughout the building without disturbing sleepers. This acoustic design wasn't accidental. It was engineered to support the community's thermal survival protocols. Recent studies using thermal imaging cameras in reconstructed longhouses have revealed something extraordinary about Viking sleeping positions. They weren't just arranged for social hierarchy or space efficiency. Every sleeping position was calculated to optimize thermal transfer between bodies, while ensuring that no individual became dangerously overheated or underheated. The Vikings understood that bodies generate different amounts of heat depending on age, body composition, and metabolic rate. They arranged groups to balanced sleeping, placing these differences high generators heat to individuals next who needed additional warmth. Pregnant women, for instance, were positioned between young warriors whose higher metabolic rates provided steady thermal support throughout the night. Children weren't just protected from cold, they were integrated into the thermal system as active participants. Young Vikings learned to recognize thermal imbalances in sleeping groups and adjust positions accordingly. They could detect when someone was becoming hypothermic before visible symptoms appeared, often through subtle changes in breathing patterns or skin temperature that they were to recognize through trained touch. The training of thermal awareness began with games and exercises that taught children to sense temperature differences with remarkable precision. They could distinguish temperature variations of less than 1 degree Fahrenheit, using only their hands. This wasn't just survival training, it was the development of superhuman thermal sensitivity that allowed the entire community to function as a living thermal monitoring system. Viking thermal technology extended to their understanding of thermal rhythm and timing. They knew that human body temperature naturally fluctuates throughout the night, dropping to its lowest point just before dawn. To counter this dangerous period, they developed awakening protocols that ensured someone was always alert during the critical pre-dawn hours when hypothermia was most likely to occur. These awakening rotations weren't random assignments. Vikings had identified individuals who naturally woke during specific time periods and organized their thermal monitoring around these biological rhythms. Some people were natural early morning wakers who took responsibility for maintaining fires during the dangerous pre-dawn hours. Others were deep sleepers who could rest soundly while providing steady thermal mass for the group. The fuel management systems developed by Vikings were masterpieces of thermal engineering that maximized heat output while minimizing resource consumption. They understood that different types of wood burned at different temperatures and for different durations. More importantly, they knew how to combine different fuel types to create sustained, controllable heat sources that could last through entire nights. Archaeological analysis of charcoal remains has revealed that Vikings created specialized fuel mixtures that burned at precisely controlled temperatures. They would combine fast-burning woods that provided immediate heat with slow-burning materials that sustained warmth for hours. Some fuel combinations were designed to produce minimal smoke, while others were formulated to create aromatic vapors that helped clear respiratory passages in the dry winter air. The timing of fuel addition to fires wasn't left to chance. Vikings developed precise schedules for feeding fires that maintained optimal temperature while preventing dangerous temperature spikes that could waste precious fuel. They could calculate fuel consumption rates with accuracy that allowed them to stretch limited wood supplies through entire winters without running short. But the most remarkable discovery comes from recent chemical analysis of Viking fire pits. Researchers have found evidence that Vikings were using controlled chemical reactions to enhance heat production. They added specific minerals and organic compounds to their fires that increased burning temperatures and extended burn times. These weren't accidental discoveries. They were deliberate chemical engineering using materials available in their environment. The Vikings had discovered that certain combinations of metals, salts, and organic materials could dramatically improve the thermal efficiency of their fires. They collected specific types of seaweed that, when dried and added to fires, created chemical reactions that produced additional heat beyond simple combustion. They used iron-rich clays that, when heated, continued radiating warmth long after fires died down. Some of these thermal enhancement techniques were so effective that modern metallurgists have studied them for potential industrial applications. Vikings were achieving burn temperatures and heat retention that approaches the efficiency of modern heating systems, using only materials they could gather from their natural environment. The integration of animals into Viking thermal systems went far beyond simply sharing body heat. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings understood the specifics of different animal thermal contribution species and arranged their livestock accordingly. Cattle provided steady, low-level heat production. Sheep generated moderate warmth while also providing wool for insulation. Pigs produced significant heat, but only for shorter periods. The positioning of animals within the longhouse followed thermal engineering principles that maximized their contribution to human comfort while ensuring the animal's own survival. Large animals were placed in areas where their body heat would circulate effectively to human sleeping areas. Smaller animals were positioned to create thermal barriers that prevented heat loss through walls and floors. Vikings even managed the feeding schedules of their animals to optimize heat production. They knew that digestion generates significant internal heat, so they timed animal feeding to coincide with the coldest parts of the night. Well-fed animals produced more body heat, contributing to the overall thermal environment of the longhouse. The waste heat from animal digestion was another thermal resource that Vikings learned to harness. They positioned animal sleeping areas so that heat from digestion and decomposition contributed to warming human spaces. This wasn't just practical waste management. It was sophisticated thermal engineering that extracted energy from every possible source. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that Vikings may have been practicing primitive forms of biogas heating. Sealed pits filled with organic waste and animal manure were positioned beneath longhouse floors, where anaerobic decomposition produced both heat and combustible gases. These gases were carefully vented and sometimes burned to provide additional thermal energy. The Vikings understood that thermal management wasn't just about generating heat. It was equally important to prevent heat loss through thermal bridging and convective cooling. They developed construction techniques that eliminated thermal bridges, the pathways that could conduct heat away from living spaces into the exterior environment. Archaeological analysis of longhouse construction reveals sophisticated understanding of thermal isolation. Vikings used multiple layer wall systems with air gaps that prevented heat conduction. They positioned structural elements to minimize thermal bridging while maintaining structural integrity. Some longhouses used curved wall designs that reduced surface area exposed to exterior cold while maximizing interior volume. The roofing systems were equally sophisticated. Vikings created multi-layer roof structures that provided thermal barriers while managing moisture and ventilation. They understood that heat rises, so they designed roof systems that captured ascending warm air and redirected it back into living spaces rather than allowing it to escape. Modern thermal analysis of reconstructed Viking buildings has shown that their construction techniques achieved thermal performance that rivals modern insulation. They accomplished this using only natural materials arranged according to principles that wouldn't be formally understood by engineering science for another millennium. The Vikings developed what might be called thermal clothing systems that went far beyond simple layering. Archaeological textile analysis reveals that they understood how different fabrics interacted to create thermal barriers while managing moisture and maintaining mobility. Their clothing wasn't just warm, it was engineered to optimize thermal performance under specific conditions. Different textile combinations were designed for different thermal situations. Clothing worn during active work had different thermal properties than garments designed for sleeping. Vikings had specialized textile combinations for extreme cold, moderate cold, and transitional weather conditions. They could adjust their thermal clothing systems with precision of modern, the technical outdoor adaptation gear. The Vikings even understood thermal, the process by which human bodies gradually adjust to cold conditions. They practiced controlled cold exposure that increased their natural tolerance to low temperatures. This wasn't just toughening up, it was physiological conditioning that actually changed their body's thermal regulation systems. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings practiced cold water immersion and controlled hypothermia exercises that trained their bodies to maintain core temperature under extreme conditions. Modern research has confirmed that such practices can actually increase the body's ability to generate heat and resist cold injury. Of Viking thermal technology continues. The legacy to influence modern cold weather survival training, military special forces units study Viking techniques for operating in extreme cold. Arctic researchers use modified Viking thermal strategies. Even modern homeless shelter design incorporates elements of Viking communal warming principles. NASA has analyzed Viking thermal management for potential use in space habitats, where thermal control is literally a matter of life and death. The principles that allowed Vikings to survive Arctic winters are being adapted for environments where the temperature difference between sun and shade can exceed 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And there you have it. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they engineered solutions that still inspire modern science, using nothing but human ingenuity and ruthless cooperation. Their thermal mastery reminds us that survival isn't about having the best technology, but about understanding the principles that govern life itself. Tonight, as you drift off in your heated home, remember those who conquered winter with only wood, wool, and unwavering determination.